Welcome to lecture 41 for APUSH. Still Dr. King Owen, even in COVID quarantine. This lecture is entitled Morning in America. It will be your introduction to Ronald Reagan. Let's start with Jimmy Carter, who has a brief 4-year interlude between the end of the Nixon era and the rise of the Reagan era. Jimmy Carter was a Georgia peanut farmer and politician who promised to be an outsider, who said to Americans, I don't come from Washington, D.C. I'm not like an insider politician. You can trust me. And so they elected him on that faith. He made a number of dramatic and powerful decisions as president that sometimes get lost in his post-presidential judgment, one of which was the Camp David Accords of 1978, which he brokered peace between Israel and Egypt and 30 years of war, a long-standing conflict between those two countries in which Egypt, in the end, admits to Israel's right to exist. That is a pretty big deal, but it's often forgotten. Partially because Jimmy Carter was president during a major energy crisis in which U.S. energy consumption was leading to quite a few economic problems. The U.S. had still not overcome its stagflation, high inflation, stagnant economy. Its dependence on foreign oil had not decreased, and the United States had not invested heavily in alternate fuels. So you're looking at a time period in which the average vehicle was like a gas-guzzling land yacht getting about 11 miles to the gallon. So Carter, wearing thick sweaters, encouraged Americans to turn down the thermostat. He put solar panels on the White House, and he said to Americans, we need the moral equivalent of war against our energy usage. Critics noted that moral equivalent of war spelled meow. Another foreign policy challenge for him was the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan in order to bolster a communist regime against Islamic insurgents. The United States was involved in this when we sent the CIA to train Afghan rebels to fight those communists because, you know, training Islamic militants, rebels, could never come back to hurt us in the future. Though one of those people who were trained was a very young Osama bin Laden. The event that derailed Carter's presidency and cemented the fact that he was not going to get a second term was the Iran hostage crisis of 1979. Iranian rebels, mostly students, overthrew the U.S.-backed dictator of Iran, who fled to the United States. They took the American embassy, kidnapped 53 Americans, and held them hostage for 444 days. It ruined Carter's chances for re-election. He worked tirelessly to try to get the hostages released, and finally did so on the day that his successor was inaugurated as president. During this time period, as oil production is disrupted in Iran, gas prices rose 149%, leading Americans to be angry economically as well as diplomatically against Carter's ineptitude. His approval rating dropped 28% to 28%, and that set up the next guy in town who would be hailed as a great communicator who would bring back the glory of the United States. Carter was a very religious man, and a lot of critics portrayed him as this biblical-esque figure who wanted to inspire Americans to, you know, a better, more moral conduct, but he just couldn't seem to do it. Americans are worshiping the golden car. This is an allusion to the biblical story of Moses coming down with the Ten Commandments. And he finds that the Israelites are being heathens and have abandoned their love for God. And lots of people portray Carter in the same way as trying to inspire Americans to better conduct, but really finding, very little power to do so. Same theme here, but this time Carter is Noah, trying to get Americans on board with his energy program, claiming that disaster is looming. But people aren't just going to buy into the ark, and so Carter's hope for saving America, not going to happen. Carter tried to wrangle with gas prices, but failed to do so during his presidency. The Iranian situation has, spiraled out of control for him, pretty much cemented his doom for a second. The new leader of Iran, spiritual leader, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, called America the Great Satan and said that the United States would suffer and fall as he called for the judgment of Allah on the evil that was Americans. And much of the revolution in Iran was not just a revolution against America's interference in Iranian government, since we had installed our own pro-American leader back in the 50s, but it's also a revolution against American culture, which the Ayatollah saw as decadent, as hedonistic, as fundamentally incompatible with Islam. So Carter was hostage to Iran in more ways than one, and it ruined his presidency. Here we see the Americans kidnapped, held hostage to blackmail the United States, and you see the quote from the Ayatollah, the great. You go down to Georgia, to Plains, Georgia, you'll see a statue to Carter there. It was built for a parade. It's in terrible shape right now, but it's a tribute to Carter as the outsider peanut farmer, and it's probably the weirdest presidential statue in American history. In the election of 1980, Ronald Reagan won with 91% of the electoral vote, 50% of the popular vote. So popular-wise, still not as good as Andrew Jackson, not as good as Lyndon Baines Johnson, but 50.9 is pretty good. Carter did poorly with 41% of the popular vote. You can see that there were several other candidates, independent and some libertarians as well. There's a connection between President Reagan and a favorite musical of mine, the musical Wicked. The song Popular in that musical has a reference to Ronald Reagan. When I see depressing creatures with unprepossessing features, I remind them on their own behalf to think of celebrated heads of state or specially great communicators. Did they have brains or knowledge? Don't make me laugh. Please, they were popular. And that really is a good description of Reagan. He was well liked. He was seen as just this embodiment of all the best promise of what the United States could be. He spoke well. He inspired confidence. He looked fatherly, grandfatherly in many ways. He's sort of like an Eisenhower-esque figure for Americans. Comfort in this time of chaos and crisis. Part of that speaking well came from the fact that he had a history as an actor, was governor of California, so not extensive political experience, but at least on the face of things, looked like he could do the job. Domestically, Reagan is known for an economic policy known as Reaganomics. Reaganomics is often referred to as supply side or trickle down economic theory, the idea that if the government gets out of the way of business, reduces taxes on businesses, then businesses can innovate, they can hire workers, they can spend money, and that is generally beneficial to the economy. The idea is pretty old. Even William Jennings Bryan referred to a version of it in the 1896 Cross of Gold speech. So Reagan, under the influence of the economists in his administration, signed into law tax cuts for the wealthy. By the end of his presidency, the top 1% would own 37% of the wealth of the United States. Historians have called this the Great Wealth Transfer. You can see how the poorest people in America got even poorer and the wealthy got even wealthier under President Reagan. So if you were a businessman in the 1980s, this is your era, this is your time. And it's such a popular trope, you know, the unscrupulous, untrustworthy businessman, that you see it in a number of movies of the time period in which the underdog, honest, ordinary, hardworking character often triumphs over the ruthless, unethical businessman. Reagan signed into policy a number of deregulation activities, which even Carter had done, cutting government rules on companies, rules that would limit how companies do business. He said, let's get rid of those rules. Companies, you do whatever you want. So they slashed environmental rules, labor rules. The idea was that if you got out of the way of a business and you reduce burdens on that business, it would be able to make more money, it could spend, hire workers, it could innovate, increase the size of its business. Reagan also cut welfare and entitlement spending, so less benefits for working folks. So we see in the cities, particularly in the 1980s into the 1990s, an increase in urban poverty, crime, and bad circumstances. Especially for the least economically powerful people in America. Their situation's getting worse and worse under President Reagan. Reagan is pretty anti-union, though he says things that sound pretty pro-union. For example, when the aircraft controllers decide to go on strike, Reagan threatens to fire them, and they persist, and he does actually fire them. Signaling that he would take the side of management of the government over that of workers. And we see overall during this time period, the 1980s and 1990s, the percentage of Americans as part of unions steadily declining and a decline in union power. Domestically, Reagan's also associated with strong religious support. In the late 70s, there was a moral majority founded by Reverend Falwell to bring more Christian policies into American politics. They wanted to restore America's connection to religion, specifically to Christianity. They don't care about other religions, it's just Christianity. They refer to themselves as the religious right. They wanted the United States to adopt policies that were in harmony with their Christian beliefs. And they found in Reagan an eloquent spokesperson for what they believed in. So Reagan courted their influence, and he spoke often with a lot of biblical quotes and phrases as signals to these people, hey, I'm on your side. Not every conservative was happy with this religious right or moral majority. The leading conservative of the 60s and 70s, Barry Goldwater, said in 1994, mark my word, if and when these preachers get control of the Republican Party, and they're sure trying to do so, it's going to be a terrible damn problem. Frankly, these people frighten me. Politics and governing demand compromise, but these Christians believe that they are acting in the name of God, so they can't and won't compromise. I know. I've tried to deal with them. So we've got, according to Goldwater, an influx of these non-compromising, religiously minded folks who are going to have a strong voice in politics. And we'll see more of that in a later lecture. So lots of Christian values are going to be injected into public policy, and you'll see all kinds of nods to that. Here is the Reverend Falwell and his singers. You notice they're dressed top to bottom because you can't show any ankle. That's not what a woman does. We're going to sing about God and Jesus and getting God back into the public schools and God back into the country. And we're going to bring back prayer and everything that we believe is the way it should be. The 1980s are the age of the yuppie, the young urban professional. You can see here the yuppie handbook noting what the yuppie wears, his pinstripe suit or the Ralph Lauren suit, a Coach bag. They've gone to a gourmet store so they can have fresh pasta, carrying their Burberry trench coat, and they play squash, and they have their Gucci briefcase. So they're rich folks. Economically speaking, the policies that created the yuppies in the 1980s also transferred wealth from the poorest Americans to the richest Americans. So between 1980 and 1990, real income for poor people dropped 9.8%, but rose 15.6% for the wealthiest Americans. So Reagan's era is definitely a time for people who are in the upper income brackets. You can see that in cartoons where Reagan's policies are mocked as hateful towards the poor, but beneficial towards the rich. That is, you could see Reagan as not welfare for poor people, but welfare for rich people. So we're not going to give unemployment. We're not going to give welfare benefits for you low-class, poor working folks. But if you're a business person, welfare for you in the name of trickle-down economics is totally okay. It led to a lot of ruthless and unethical practices in the stock market. As Herblock notes in this cartoon from 1985, lots of business takeovers, ruthless tactics, unethical and downright illegal things were happening. It caught, for example, junk bond dealer Michael Milken. You see it in movies in the 1980s where the ruthless businessman is, doing unethical things, and some poor schmuck working in the company eventually like overturns the businessman. It's just like this fantasy of, fighting these business folks. But in real life, it doesn't really happen until 1989, when a whole bunch of savings and loans are on the verge of bankruptcy and the government has to bail them out. In 1987, the stock market has already crashed as a result of these wild business practices. So in some ways, the 80s are almost a replay of the 1920s. Reagan is also associated with an extensive military buildup, the projecting of this image of strength and power. The United States will not be weak. We will flex our muscle and the world will bow to us. So military expenses went up 189% under President Reagan. Part of that was an expensive program known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was nicknamed Star Wars. It would create lasers and satellites to shoot down incoming Soviet missiles. So it's supposed to be this high-tech response to the Cold War. It was technologically impossible at the time. Scientists knew it was impossible, but they just kept taking government checks and like, sure, I'm working. I'll keep working on it. I keep building this. Maybe it'll be ready in a year, a couple of years. Don't ask. Just keep sending me checks. They spent billions of dollars on it, $70 billion to be precise, for something that never really was feasible. But historians have argued increasingly since the 1990s that this warlike stance put pressure on the Soviet Union. That's a matter of some debate, whether or not Reagan in effect helped hasten the end of the Cold War by all of this warlike stance in this defense spending. For example, inside the Soviet Union, the Soviets had already started policies to reform communism. Not end communism, but to reform it, to save it. These are the policies of glasnost and perestroika. And part of that is in response to the Soviets' own internal problems. Their spending was way out of control. The Afghan war had hurt them in the same way that the Vietnam War hurt the United States. And so Reagan may have not been putting as much pressure on them as pressure was existing inside the Soviet Union. By 1987, Reagan and the Soviets signed a treaty to reduce nuclear weapons, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And by 1989, just as the Reagan presidency was ending, the Soviet Union would collapse. The Cold War itself would be declared over in 1991. I will leave you with this current word by Beth Fisher, historian, who has written a very recent book, i.e. 2019, on the myth of Reagan ending the Cold War, the myth of triumphalism. And this is what Beth Fisher says. Reagan's policies did not compel Moscow to disarm, adopt democratic reforms, withdraw from its war in Afghanistan, and collapse. Rather, the hardline policies of Reagan's first term brought the superpowers to the brink of war in 1983. I actually remember this because I was a kid in elementary school. Moreover, the high-tech SDI research program did not cause the Soviets to be so fearful that they acquiesced to American demands to disarm. In fact, military scientists concluded SDI could be easily countered and in all likelihood would never be built. Perhaps most importantly, increases in U.S. defense spending did not compel the Kremlin to invest in a buildup of its own. So, no, Reagan did not lead to an end to the Cold War as much as we would like to think he did. Here's Reagan's national debt increase, 189% compared to Carter's, 42, Bush 55, Clinton 36, and Bush 2, 89. People at the time noted Reagan's love for the military, so here Reagan is shown spending lavishly on defense, but ignoring cities, urban problems, social security, and the environment. Here we see a mocking of the Strategic Defense or Star Wars program, which essentially would have a laser bounce off a satellite. It'd have another satellite to bounce off of, and then it could shoot down incoming missiles. It was never really going to get off the ground, though could possibly today maybe technologically be possible. Lots of people compared it to stories of flight in Mary Poppins, Dumbo, Superman, Peter Pan, saying that the United States' investment in this program was just ridiculously stupid. Reagan's hard line against communism, however, did have an impact in Latin America and South America, as well as the Middle East. A good example of this is the island of Grenada in 1983, which was under the threat of a possible alliance with the Soviets. So this island regime was possibly going to ally with the Soviets. It looked like Soviets were being involved there. So the United States sent Marines to topple this regime to an island with no real strategic value or importance to the United States in perhaps one of the best operation names for a military operation, Urgent Fury. The United States dropped leaflets all over the island with cartoons explaining why the United States were getting involved in this little tiny non-strategic island. And in one of the cartoons, it says, has one of the villagers of the island saying, "Thank God for President Reagan and our freedom-loving northern neighbors." Perhaps the worst of Reagan's blunders, foreign policy-wise, came from Nicaragua. In the mid to late 80s, Nicaragua had a civil war between the Contras, who were a guerrilla force trying to take over the country, against the communists who were in control of Nicaragua. So this looks like many of the Cold War conflicts we've studied, like a North versus a South, or in this case, just a non-communist versus communist group. Reagan, favoring the Contras against the Sandinistas, the communist group, wanted to send them weapons and provide them support. So he did send the CIA to train them, and he did funnel them military support until Congress said you can't do that anymore. So there was an amendment passed, the Boland Amendment, that said the United States could not support these Contras, because it turns out they were selling cocaine, they were murdering journalists, and raping nuns. And that didn't look good for the United States to be supporting that. So Reagan found a secret way to make this happen. Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North, working for Reagan, sold missiles to Iran, that country that loves the United States. And then he funneled the profits to the Contras so that the Contras could still get support from the US. Well, all of this was uncovered, and in the middle of the scandal, Reagan miraculously got off pretty much scot-free, and North kind of took the blame for most of it. Reagan claimed that he really didn't know what was going on. He had no memory of all of this. And he actually told the American people this quote. I just love this quote. "A few months ago, I told the American people that I did not trade arms for hostages. My heart and my best intentions still tell me that's true, but the facts and the evidence tell me that it's not." Yeah. So cartoons about Reagan, once again, portraying Reagan's image as one thing, but behind the scenes doing something else. This would be the Ayatollah of Iran, our ally. Oh, wait, no, our enemy that held our people captive in 1979. Lots of people said that Reagan would be brought down by the scandal, but surprisingly enough, he wasn't. Um, the famous quote from Reagan's statement about this was that mistakes were made. It's a great use of the passive voice. Mistakes were made. Well, by whom? Who made those mistakes? Oh, just mistakes were made. Other people said that Reagan was just as bad as Nixon, and yet it didn't cause Reagan to resign the presidency. The report pretty much condemned Reagan and his vice president, the next President Bush, noting that they had knowledge of the whole thing and had probably given authorization for it. And yet, it did not derail him. This gave Reagan the nickname the Teflon President. I'll give you with this pro-con look at Reagan. The pro, Reagan was a good president. He's charming, great communicator, restored confidence. He launched a war on drugs and tried to tackle the issue of crime, increased defense spending, challenged the Soviet Union, encouraged the freedom fighters in Nicaragua. There was an economic boom between 1982 and 1990 for the wealthy, but Reagan did get stagflation under control, signed a lot of wilderness protection bills, discouraged strikes. He encouraged states to create job training programs to help poverty, tax cuts to help businesses. He didn't really do anything to help African Americans, but he did nominate the first woman to the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor. So good step forward for feminism. On the con side, Reagan is a poor president. A lot of people said that he was really just an actor. He didn't really have the intellect to be president. Hands-off leadership led to a lot of scandal. And Reagan has something like 183 ethics violations under his presidency. Violent crime actually increased during his presidency. The war on drugs failed. In fact, it spent a lot of money and increased drug abuse. The foreign policy was a waste of money. Soviets were already weakening. The Iran-Contra affair was actually a huge violation of law and ethics. The nation was constantly in a budget deficit. On the environment, Reagan once said, trees cause more pollution than automobiles do. I'll let you take that as it is. He did fire the air traffic controllers in 1981. Cut welfare programs. Poverty rate actually went up to 15% of the nation being in poverty. Income inequality increased. He opposed affirmative action, opposed extending the Voting Rights Act, and opposed challenging apartheid in South Africa. So that's the pro-con look at Reagan.